All right, so hi everyone. Thanks for coming to our panel discussion or debate on the topic of fiduciary duties in the age of public blockchains. So with us today we have Angela, we have Peter and Vlad. So I think we might just start with a brief introduction from the panelists themselves, just like a 1-2 sentence of who you are and what you do in the space.
Sure. So I'm Angela Walsh, and I'm a law professor at St. Mary's University School of Law and a research fellow at the Center for Blockchain Technologies at University College London. And I've written about governance, duties, and risks in public blockchain systems.
I'm Peter Van Valkenburg. I'm the Director of Research at CoinCenter, which is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to preserving the freedom to innovate using open blockchain technologies. You've probably seen me maybe on clips on Twitter or YouTube testifying before Congress or things like this. I got to debate Nouriel Roubini in front of the Senate Banking Committee, and I've said this before, and Peter McCormick has said this on his podcast. I often wish it had been Angela, who I think is a much more thoughtful critic of these technologies than Professor Roubini, who I guess I just suggested he's not thoughtful, but
not as thoughtful as Angela, which is hard to be. Yeah, I'm Vlad Zamfir. I work on consensus protocols, and I'm also concerned about consensus protocol governance, and I've been doing research in governance, law, politics, and related topics.
Okay, cool. So I think before we begin, I think it would be helpful to start with just a quick definition, just to set what we're talking about. So Peter, would you mind telling me on a high level, in a legal sense, what the term fiduciary duty refers to and what parties it generally involves?
Sure. So that's why I have the ABA's 130-page paper on fiduciary duties in front of me. So this will be brief, I promise. No, it's a really hard topic to condense into a short definition, because fiduciary duty is a type of legal duty that certain people owe to other people. And it's a very high duty, in other words. So it involves several duties that people might have to other people. It's typically brought up in the context of management or directors of a corporation and the duties they owe to shareholders of that corporation. And the bundle of duties that they might owe are things like a duty of care, to not act negligently, to not screw up, basically. A duty of loyalty, to act in the interests of the shareholders rather than selfishly in their own interests. And then there's a bunch of other lesser duties that are usually bundled in there, like a duty to account, a duty of confidentiality, a duty of full disclosure. Interesting how those two things could potentially conflict with each other. A duty to act fairly, because we all know what fairness is. A duty of good faith and fair dealing, and there's even more than those in the ABA report and in common law theory of fiduciary duty relationships, which goes back hundreds of years. So a couple brief things I want to point out on that vague definition that I've just offered you. As far as legal duties that people owe to other people, this is a very, very heightened duty. So the duty of care, to not screw up, if you will, is much more onerous than the typical duty that a stranger owes another stranger. So stranger duties of care are things like you have a duty to act reasonably with your own property for whatever purposes you want to act, but not to act unreasonably and through that negligence harm someone else. If you do, they can sue you for tort breach of duty rather than fiduciary breach of duty, which is between known parties. This is between stranger parties. So in fiduciary relationships, the duty of care is heightened. You have to take extra steps to not screw up rather than simply act reasonably with your own property. And then another thing is that the duty of loyalty in fiduciary duties, as compared to the duty of care in tort duties, is a duty to not act in your own interests. It's a duty to act in someone else's interests. So the director or the manager of a corporation has to think of how their actions affect the shareholders, not how their actions affect their own person. So it's not like I decided to build something on my property because I thought it was good and whoops, it hurt somebody, or it didn't hurt somebody. And if it didn't hurt somebody, I can do whatever I want. I have to think of my property and building things on it that are actually in someone else's interests, not in my own. I can't necessarily think of my own interests within the context of this duty. So you're no longer making hamburgers, is how I think of it, because you think you can sell them at a profit. You're maximizing your own well-being. You now have to make hamburgers because you want to improve the health and well-being of the people who eat your hamburgers, which, if you're putting buns on them, means you just probably shouldn't put buns on them because carbs are going to kill them in the long run when they get diabetes. So it really changes the way a person runs their business or runs their personal activities because they have to act in someone else's interests, and that can be rather profound liabilities. Now, the last thing I want to say on fiduciary duties, and then maybe I won't even talk much more on this panel because I'm already talking a lot, is we think these things are great, right? We think, yeah, those crooks at the top of, a giant corporation should owe a lot of care to the people who are their shareholders. So let's strengthen those duties and make them more robust, and will help avoid financial crisis and things like this. Caution. Fiduciary duties might have actually caused the financial crisis. So Lehman Brothers, so Bear Stearns gets bailed out, right? Lehman Brothers is in dire straits. They're massively over-leveraged, about to go bankrupt. They know that Bear Stearns got bailed out. They are in negotiations with Bank of America and a series of other financial institutions to sell this toxic firm so that it can be recovered. What does the director of Lehman do to maximize shareholder value? Hold out for the highest damn price they can get from the people who are offering to buy Lehman. And what is the maximum price you can hold out for? The maximum amount of money that the government would be willing to buy and bail out Lehman. And what is that? Whatever the government values the economy not collapsing. So the director of Lehman Brothers was called insane and irrational by several people in retrospect for not selling to Bank of America and holding out for a higher price. But it was completely rational, and probably his duty to not sell at that lower price, because his duty was loyalty to shareholders to maximize their profits. He didn't have a duty to the general public, just to his shareholders. And the economy collapsed in part because of this bankruptcy. So, caution about fiduciary duties.
That's a new one.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that definition, Peter. So obviously, fiduciary duty, it comes with multiple layers of definition, and we've seen how it plays out really in the traditional world. And now we're entering into this age of public blockchains, and I think that definition might, have to also change a little. So, Angela, you recently published an academic paper, and in it you proposed that certain developers of blockchain projects act as fiduciary and should be treated as such legally. Can you explain your claim and why it's so controversial?
Sure. Okay. Can you guys? Am I on? Yeah. Okay. Great. So I published a paper recently that that has been kind of in the process for a really long time, years. I'm very slow. So the paper argues that certain developers in public blockchain systems, the developers of the protocols, the underlying protocols, like, for example, a Bitcoin or Ethereum, actually do function as fiduciaries within these systems, in that they hold roles of high trust, okay? The people who I think repose trust in developers include people who hold tokens on these systems, miners, actually, who run software that the developers create, all the nodes in the network, and people who are now building things on top of these underlying protocols, okay? So as we're seeing DeFi, for instance, being developed, right? All of the people who are building systems above it are relying ultimately on the code that the developers develop at the bottom of the chain. Okay, so Peter mentioned the two main types of duties, the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. And I actually think that those are both relevant here and super important. And when I started thinking about this, viewing these parties as fiduciaries, way back, I gave my first presentation about this idea back in 2014, which is, yes, I'm very slow to write, apparently. I was focused more on the duty of care, okay? That their code has to be so good in a system where there is actually money and value embedded in it, okay? That's a really significant thing that is different from, excuse me, prior open source software projects. And right, that's why everybody is here. We can transfer value through software now, right? Legitimate value, hold value within, hold digital value. So I was very focused on the duty of care. You don't want to screw things up, put a bug in there that can make the whole system collapse. As things have evolved in the industry, I'm actually really thinking that the duty of loyalty is just as important, if not more so. And I say that because there are opportunities for developers of protocols to have asymmetric information, to know things that other people counting on the system don't know. And as additional systems, all of these financial products are being built atop this, there are more opportunities for developers to exploit this asymmetric information, okay? So I would be very surprised if people would be okay if one of the Bitcoin core developers, if they found out that one of the Bitcoin core developers was being paid by a particular exchange outside the system, right, to push certain strategies or code for the blockchain, to advocate for those. Okay? Without a duty of loyalty there's nothing preventing them from doing this, right? One of the arguments that comes out against this is that everything's public, right? It's all on GitHub and you can see everything. You can see code and you can see a lot of discussions, but that doesn't necessarily represent the full world. Okay, finally, I'll just say a very quick word about why this is controversial. It's controversial because developers are not used to being liable for anything, right? That is the existing paradigm, and tech has had a very strong liability shield for a long time. We're starting to see chinks, I think, in that liability shield with the considerations we're seeing about Facebook, Google, platform liability, et cetera. I think that we really need to think about how these systems are different from existing systems in that they're much more high stakes. So the existing liability paradigm may need to shift.
Yeah, I mean, I think that underscores the sort of difficulty and tension along with, on one hand, this is an open source technology, everything should be transparent and open, but on the other hand, it is very much humans behind it, right? And there's transparent parts in it, but also certain things that you can just never see, right? So, and so speaking of, developer liability, which I think is a pretty hot topic issue, Vlad, I know you've, thought about this extensively. What are your thoughts around liability in blockchain governance? And I know another thing that you write about a lot is the, code is law thing. So can you explain to, I guess, the audience and also us what your thoughts are?
Sure. Well, to me, there's absolutely no question in my mind that we have a collective and individual moral responsibility for the consequences of our actions in the blockchain space. The question of, this public policy / law question of what should the liability be for developers, I think is a different kind of question. It's like a institutional design question, a question of, what incentives and how disputes should be handled in blockchain governance. And that's a question that's much harder to answer than the question of are we morally responsible? So I like to start off with a moral question and say very much decentralization doesn't absolve you of all moral responsibility. Just because you take a small role in an action doesn't mean that you're not culpable at all. That doesn't mean though that you should necessarily be liable to the highest extent, because liability means that it's more difficult to take a role. Possibly it might create barriers, and so that the design decision around liability, I think, is separate from the moral question, which I think very much I'm offended by the lack of moral responsibility that people have in the space, and the kind of escapism that people have with respect to their moral liability or moral responsibility. And I think people have a very similar approach with respect to legal liability. Where they basically very much take an I'm not liable and it's not my fault and I should be basically completely immune from any disputes because all I'm doing is exercising speech in my software development. On the other hand, I am very cautious about the duty of loyalty and duty of care because I know that there's many different stakeholders with inconsistent interests. Who who am I supposed to have a duty of care and loyalty to? Coin holders or users? and there's, or miners or developers or any of the number of stakeholders, like third parties that might have interest in this infrastructure. And they don't have compatible interests, and so there's very much a world where people have conflicting interests, and developers acting in a position of power and governance need to trade off between the interests of very many different stakeholders, and they can't do this in a way that's unconflicted because they represent multiple stakeholders, and they aren't going to be able to care perfectly for any one of them. So I think the care and loyalty question is kind of complicated,
Yeah.
and I think the liability question is also complicated. And I'm not a lawyer, but I definitely think that we should act like we're responsible for what happens, because the technology is powerful enough, and people are intending to use it as public infrastructure, so that there could really be a lot of damages that happen if people are careless with the governance of these platforms.
So I completely agree with Vlad that this is a question of institutional design. I completely agree on first principles that there is some level of moral ethical culpability for people who build these systems, just as there's some moral ethical culpability for people who put anything into the world that could help or harm other people. Now, the question of institutional design is a question of, will you crush the socially beneficial activity if you impose liability or duties that are so egregious that they would basically drive everyone out of building those productive systems, engaging in those productive activities? And this is not a new question. We're all in this space, and we're thinking, oh, it's blockchain week in New York, this is amazing. We're discussing things that have never been discussed before. The question of how far you allow the law to create liability has been discussed for centuries. Going only 100 years back to Oliver Wendell Holmes in a case called Robbins Dry Dock and Repair versus Flint. Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of our most famous justices of American jurisprudence, said, "The law does not extend itself too far, does not spread its protection too far." Now, why is that? It's because if the law was to protect people from every possible harm, no one would ever do anything. So think about this. There's a hamburger restaurant. I don't know why I'm on about hamburgers today. And it's doing real well. It's got a good clientele. They're making good hamburgers. They're making profit. You see that and you say, I could do better. And you open a hamburger restaurant right across the street. They go out of business because you did better than them. That is you harming someone else. Now, should they be able to sue you for opening a business across the street and being a better competitor? I think absolutely not, and I think most people would agree. And this is actually the classical explanation, maybe not with hamburgers, for where the law does not extend itself to. And the Latin for that is damnum absque injuria, harm without injury. You did something that actually did harm someone, but the law doesn't recognize a legally addressable injury. So that's at the extreme. You can do things that might harm people, but there shouldn't be liability. And at the other extreme are you have to act in the interests of other people. So this is where the institutional design question gets really hard, because the other extreme is Angela suggesting fiduciary duty, where you are always culpable and always obliged to act in the interest of your shareholders. Now, does that work here? I don't think so. As I explained with Lehman Brothers, this is what created the perverse incentives that actually destroyed our financial system back in 2008, because people were acting in powerful capacities just to enrich their shareholders. Do I want the developers of, say, Zcash, and I'm a board member of the foundation, so, full disclosure, do I want the developers of Zcash to focus on building a protocol that will enrich Zcash holders? No. I want the developers of Zcash to focus on building the best goddamn software to protect financial privacy that can be built. And if that means that the price of Zcash falls, then so be it. You impose a duty of loyalty, it's going to end up with the simplest possible terms of deciding whether you've obeyed that duty or not. Did you enrich those people? Were you loyal to them? Did you maximize their shareholder value? You would be infecting this space, which is a reaction to the financial crisis, with the very perverse incentives that allowed the financial industry in 2008 to basically get a free bailout from the government after screwing us for years. I might have gone too far just then, I don't know. Now, what kind of liability could you have instead? Because this is an institutional design process. Well, we have obligations and duties to strangers, to people who we don't represent their interests. We are all working together in a society. And this is tort liability. I have a duty not to use my property to harm someone else. And if I do, if I'm a Zcash developer and I build some property that harms somebody else, then if I was negligent in building it, I should be sued. And that's a completely different form of duty and liability. That's tort, not fiduciary duty. Now, there's a problem here. There's an old, in fact, the Oliver Wendell Holmes case I was just citing for established this principle in tort law that says you can't recover from someone who was negligent in a tort action if the damages were purely economic losses. In other words, you can only recover if someone was physically harmed. And this goes back, obviously, before the internet, and this is maybe where things are radically new, in that no one ever gets physically harmed on the internet by somebody else, generally speaking. They get economically harmed or informationally harmed, which means you're barred from suing that person for negligence. That bar from recovery is probably where we need to rethink the institutional design. Maybe you should be able to sue a software developer under a negligence theory of tort liability. But should that software developer be a fiduciary for people who use their software? I think absolutely not. It would create very perverse incentives.
Okay, so that's hard to follow, right? But I think, I think Peter makes some good points. But as I said initially, I really don't think it's as simple as whether they built code that doesn't break, okay? That's only telling one part of the story. Your tort can potentially help with, with the duty of care side. Tort does not help with the duty of loyalty side. And I can't figure out a way around this. And it's not like blockchains are not already struggling with this very issue, okay? So I watch things on Twitter, right? I'm sure many of you do too, okay? You've seen the discussions within the Ethereum community about, are there conflicts of interest between different developers? Can they work on two competing protocols at the same time, right? Or do we have to be suspicious of their involvement in one if they're working on another, right? That was the crux of this Offrey Gate or whatever it was, right? He was accused of having conflicts of interest and the whole thing blew up. Well, conflicts of interest is about the duty of loyalty, okay? People already believe that developers have a duty of loyalty. All I'm doing is labeling what the expectations are here.
So, not everyone had those expectations, right? It was like a controversial thing, and like a lot of people were kind of upset about how it played out. I don't think
that's fair. Not everybody necessarily did, but clearly there wouldn't have been a debate unless a significant or some loud people felt that way.
So the coin holders have an immediate interest. So when someone talks shit about the project in a way that might look bad for the narrative, for traders, they have to they kind of fight back. And I'm wondering, if you want to address this question of duty of loyalty to who?
Sure. Yeah. No.
I also want to ask just the panelists a two-part question, which is first, are DAOs the answer to some of these frictions? No. And yeah, well, tell me why. And then also, follow-up is, do you think that the fears and uncertainty around, whether or not a developer would incur any sort of liability push them to go the more anonymous route, right? Would we see the rise of that?
I mean, I think absolutely it would push people underground. You either just destroy people's willingness to engage in the socially beneficial activity because the crushing liability of being one person who owes duties to maybe thousands of complete strangers and a very severe duty, loyalty towards those strangers that they've never met. So you would either just not do the thing anymore. I really wanted to work on zero knowledge proofs and integrating them into blockchains so that we can have private money that saves us from surveillance states and giant corporations. But the only way to do that is to basically be sued out of existence by default because there's so many potential plaintiffs. Or you say, I'm so dedicated to this that I'm going to go underground. Yeah. Because I know if I do it legally and above board, I will get sued out of existence. So I'm going to move to a corner of the world where I think I won't be found. I'm going to use Tor, and I'm going to develop these systems that will work towards freedom and breaking the old system of liability rules that were perverse, that I saw as actually causing the problems in the economy that I'm trying to fix. So that's, yeah.
Okay, so I'm curious why we can't not exactly mirror the fiduciary duties that we see in corporate systems, right?
Why we can not exactly mirror it by using tort liability here instead of fiduciary liability.
It misses the duty of loyalty. It misses the asymmetric.
Deliberately.
I know, but it misses the asymmetric obligations or asymmetric information here, okay?
But the hamburger stand that outcompetes the other hamburger stand had some asymmetric information, and it was their incentive to better compete because they have some unique special sauce that actually created goodness in the world. Sometimes asymmetric
I'm not
information
arguing that
creates a profit
Ethereum
motive.
should be accountable for, if it does harm to Bitcoin. I'm not arguing that at all. I'm arguing that developers within these systems should be accountable, potentially, to the people who count on them to make them work and not cheat them. And
How do they find each other, and
Why-
how do they measure whether they were accountable, though?
Right, okay. So absolutely, this idea is not fully formed, and there is not generations of case law to look back on. This may be a new idea. We may have to figure out how this new duty of loyalty works, right? Do we want to echo the idea that what it means to be loyal is to maximize shareholder value at all costs, right?
You agree that that would be terrible in this context, right?
I think there are many more things to consider than just shareholder value.
I think we both agree
Absolutely,
there.
yes,
And
absolutely.
I'm
There's systemic issues that you need to agree, and that's why in my writings I've acknowledged that there's also a larger potential duty to the public, and I think there is important academic work that still needs to be done, thinking about these systems potentially as new sovereigns, and what does that mean in our accountability framework, right? Sovereigns have sovereign immunity, right? So I don't know.
We certainly don't want that.
So there's extremes here, right? Oh shoot, what was I going to say? Okay, as far as the pushing people underground because you're going to cripple them with liability, I don't understand why we can't have insurance here and potentially do the same kinds of things that we've done with in the past to address a risk. An argument. Can I finish? Can I finish first? So, in the past, when liability is imposed, people figure out a system for making people comfortable enough to assume that liability, right, while also still protecting those, right, whom they pose a risk to. So I don't see why that couldn't develop here.
Some types of liabilities simply can't be insured for. You won't find liquid markets for insurance because the risk can't be quantified because it is effectively unlimited. It is Knightian uncertainty rather than calculable risk, to use the economic term. And that's what courts are looking at in the last 150 years, where they said we cannot extend tort liability, not even fiduciary liability, to economic losses, because the economic system is a highly interconnected system where lots of people do lots of things that harm or help lots of people. So if you create a strong liability regime, there's an unlimited set of plaintiffs that could sue you simply for engaging in economic activities. And that would never be something you could get insurance for because it can't even be calculated. Now, I think you're right. We should consider new designs and new liability regimes, but maybe the one we do is a baby step. From damnum absque injuria, you can do whatever you want and there's no legal redressable harm, to fiduciary duty. In between, we have tort liability. You said your software was going to do X, and you thought you were doing your best to get there, but in fact you were negligence. So you didn't harm someone. You can already sue them for fraud. You just can't right now sue them for negligence. Maybe we loosen the economic loss rule so that people who have purely economic damages can find some legal cause of action to go after developers who were negligent. That, I think, is a reasonable approach between crypto anarchy on one end and the corporate fiduciary duty structures that we've had that frankly have not worked well. Not worked well at all, because the duty was always to shareholders, to loyalty to shareholders, rather than to strangers or the general public at large.
Yeah. So we're actually already running out of time, but Angela, I'm going to let you just respond, a very quick response, and Vod, if you have anything to add, and then we really have to wrap up.
Okay. I primarily see a lot of the responses to this as, one, I don't see the asymmetric power that you perceive. So I'm in continuing this discussion, wherever it continues, I want to see if people are actually seeing what I'm seeing, that these do look like fiduciaries, people who have acted as fiduciaries in the past. Are we at least in agreement on that point, right? That there are these asymmetries here. Second, I don't think that the arguments that Peter has raised are really arguments against liability altogether, pretty much.
I just said we should impose tort liability.
Okay.
Yes, okay.
No, it's an institutional design question.
Yeah.
Yes, and we disagree with where to draw the line, I guess.
What type of liability and what type of duty?
Okay.
Which is a good thing to disagree about because it's about nuts and
It does
bolts.
it. Yeah. Are we agreeing on something? Are we agreeing that
There should be some amount of liability.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of damnum absque iuria, that you can just, that all of
do
these
you
are
agree
harms
that
without
there
injury.
are asymmetries in information?
There are asymmetries in information about everything.
Do you agree
some
that they
people know
exist
that
here
gold has a
between
certain number of protons and neutrons, and some
do you agree
people
that
don't.
do you agree that there are asymmetries in information between the core devs and the people who are using tokens, nodes, miners at certain points in the process?
It's an absurd question because there are asymmetries of information between
Important
everyone.
important asymmetries of
That
information
rise to the level of a
that
need
may
for a
be
fiduciary
exploited
duty?
that may be exploited by developers to their own benefit
Every
and not
form
the benefit
of
the
asymmetric
system.
information can be exploited in the market, and
Do
we
you agree
want
that it
people to
exists?
exploit it so that
Okay,
they
I think
reveal
we're
their
going to have to agree to
information.
disagree because we're 5 minutes over. So Vlad, if you have anything to add,
Sorry.
to the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's also some kind of interesting public law and public policy questions that haven't really come up yet because we've mostly been talking about damages to individuals and to private entities. So there's a lot of, a lot of the orientation around the legal thinking in the blockchain space has been around private law and people consensually using software and only being impacted in a private setting. But public blockchains exist very publicly, they're very publicly accessible. And I think that they're in the realm of public policy, and there's a lot of public considerations and public harms that I don't think fall inside the scope of this conversation right now.
Yeah, okay. Well, so that got heated. We're gonna need way more time to really delve into this, but obviously a lot of nuances, and I would encourage everyone to read Angela's paper as well as Peter, you've written a couple articles on the Coin Center blog, sort of arguing your own points. So
Right.
with
Can
that-
I say one quick thing? So Peter and I are continuing our conversation tonight, and it's actually going to be on Peter McCormick's podcast. So, woohoo!
Yes. All right, and thank you guys, and sorry to the organizers for running so over.
Sorry.